you see on your handout is called a practicum on living the sanctified life. Now, if you're in, for example, in the medical field or you're in the teaching field, you're familiar with the idea of a practicum. It's where you take everything that you learn in school and then you have to make it work in a real life situation. You know, teachers have practicums, nurses have practicums. You know, various careers or employments have those types of things, and this is a practicum beginning in chapter 12 of everything that Paul's been teaching the people. Okay, the book of Romans really divides into, if you wanted to look in major sections, is the first 11 chapters and the last 5 chapters. And the first 11 chapters are heavy on what we call theology. Okay, in other words, lots of teaching about God, a lot of teaching about what God has done, what the Son has done, what the Spirit has done. And then you get to chapter 12, and then it starts a whole new thrust, and that is what to do with what you've learned. In other words, how does what you've learned play out in everyday life? And so that's why I called this, titled this chapter 12, a practicum on living the sanctified life, because this is a very, very practical chapter. Okay, it's just how to deal or how to live righteously before God and before your fellow man. And so you see on the second paragraph ahead of number 1, the last line there, F.F. Bruce says, in view of all that God has accomplished for His people in Christ, how should His people live? And that's bound up in the word therefore in verse 1. Now, therefore is not the first word in the translation, but it probably should be. Therefore, I beseech you, brethren, by the mercies of God. Okay, question 1. I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you what? What's next? What's our blank? Present your bodies a what? Living sacrifice, holy, acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. Now, you may have, if you have reasonable service in your 2 blanks, it's because you are reading the King James or the New King James Version of the Bible. Those are the only 2 translations that provide that rendering of reasonable service. Reasonable is a little bit obscure, but what it means is what is logical or rational. And we think about somebody who's reasonable as somebody who can be talked to, can be disagreed with. That's not the meaning of reasonable here. It has to do with the mind. Okay? The word service is the proper rendering. Okay, the word service is the proper rendering, and I'll talk a little bit about that. I have more detail than is in your handout when we get down to the bottom of the page, but I don't want to get too far ahead of myself because we're going to break this particular verse down into various words and component parts. Okay, so Paul says, "I beseech you." It says, "I beseech you, therefore, brethren." The word beseech. Is a word that has to do with pleading or, in some cases, comforting. But the word there is to plead or to urge. Okay, I like the word plead because of the idea of somebody approaching another and just giving them a word of encouragement. A word of encouragement. However, it's more than that in the sense that Paul is giving it to the people. He could have said, "I command you, therefore," and it wouldn't have strengthened or negated the meaning at all. But Paul is making really an impassioned plea, but there's the voice of authority behind that plea. Okay, and so he's pleading with them to act under the force of the mercies of God. In other words, rather than just issue a straight up command to do a certain thing, he's like, just consider everything that God has done for you, everything that we've been talking about. In other words, if you'll just take a minute and think about everything that God has done for you, you'll want to live right. You'll want to be the kind of person that God would have you to be, and that's the thought here behind this statement. So, and then in the second line of that first paragraph, speaking, it says, on the implied force of the word beseech. In other words, it's an urging, it's a plea, but the authority of Paul as an apostle puts some weight behind it, so to speak. It says, this is a cultural statement, when you truly understand and contemplate all that God has done to save you through Christ, how can you do less than offer your bodies as living sacrifices? You need no other motive than this. All right? Now, if we were going to put this kind of in practical terms, and again, I'm just thinking about me personally, okay? Just thinking about me personally. Nobody has to tell me to call my mama. Nobody has to remind me to call my mom. Nobody has to, and those of you that have known me and my mom for a long time, you probably know, that we have an arrangement that at whatever time in her life she becomes unable to take care of herself, she's moving in with me. I mean, the house that I live in was built for that express purpose, because that's what my mom did for her parents. And I saw my mom doing it for her parents. And by the way, and we've had this agreement long before they ever even moved to Alabama, which was almost 20 years ago now. It's hard to believe my folks came to Alabama 20 years ago. But this has been an understanding between us even before my grandparents died, that I was going to take care of my mom. In other words, nobody has to tell me that it's my obligation. Nobody has to scold me to remember my obligation to my mother. Why? Because I know everything that she's done for me. And in view of that, I'm going to take care of her. In other words, I am compelled from the inside out to do that. All right? That's what Paul's talking about here. When we think about everything that God has done for us through Jesus Christ, and then if we were to extend it to what He's done through the Holy Spirit in giving us the Bible and the indwelling and the strengthening in the inner man, when we think about everything that the God of heaven has done for us, how can we do anything less than give Him our very best at all times? Now, obviously, we sin and fall short, but the point is, am I trying to give God my best at all times? And if I'm not, then that has to be a reflection on me personally, because I have forgotten what God has done for me if I don't give Him my best at all times. And then I want to look at the word present. Present your bodies as a living sacrifice. The word present there means to literally stand before, stand beside, or make a presentation of self. And there are a couple of pictures that we can paint here that help illustrate what this idea is. For example, picture in your mind a man bringing a lamb to the altar for sacrifice. Now, what is he doing? He's bringing that lamb and he's presenting that lamb. And as a part of that sacrifice, that lamb is going to be inspected, right? Now, there's a sense in which he should have already inspected that lamb. to bring what God wanted him to bring. But he's presenting that lamb and he's saying, here's my sacrifice. Examine it inside and out. All right. Also, the picture is this. Think about soldiers falling into, what is it called, muster? When they bring them all together, or they line up for inspection.
Oh yeah.
All right, Bob is like, oh yeah. All right, so what happens? Every soldier presents himself, for inspection, and some senior superior or senior officer inspects the troops. Well, what is he looking at? He's making sure that your shoes are shined. You don't come to inspection with scuffed up shoes. You don't come with buttons unbuttoned, or your shirt untucked, or your shoes or your boots untied. In other words, you're presenting yourself as being as ready to be inspected. All right? And then there's a third picture. And that's the picture that's found in the book of Job. In Job chapter 1 and Job chapter 2. And I'm just going to read the text because you can see it, okay? Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves to the Lord. By the way, the sons of God is a reference to men who are living right. Worshippers of God, servants of God. That's the phrase sons of God. They've presented themselves to the Lord. Now, I don't know what all was entailed in that. But it's almost like God called an assembly of all of His people, and the men came and presented themselves to the Lord. Chapter 2, verse 1, there came a day when the sons of God came to present themselves to the Lord. All right, so I beseech you therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies as living sacrifices. Living sacrifices. And then two descriptive terms: holy and acceptable to God. Holy means to be set apart, sanctified, fit for divine service. And acceptable to God means you present yourself to God on God's terms. You've heard about, are the conditions acceptable? Right? So, am I presenting myself in an acceptable way? Am I presenting myself to God on God's terms? All right. So in these senses, Christians, this is the middle of the second paragraph, third line. Christians should stand before God at all times, willing and even desiring to be inspected. I want you to think about that for a minute. We ought to be willing to be inspected, but we also should desire to be inspected. Hebrews 4 and verse 13 says, all things are naked and open in the eyes of Him with whom we must, one of the renderings is, with whom we have to do. The meaning is, to Him to whom we must give an account. What did David say? What did David say? I gave some passages here. I'll just read some of these from the book of Psalms. Psalm 139 and verse number 23. Search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me, know my anxieties, and see if there is any wicked way in me. David wanted God to inspect him. Why? Because he wanted to make sure that he was acceptable to God. In other words, David didn't want to just leave it up to, David didn't just want to leave it up to himself as to whether or not he was acceptable to God. He wanted God to do the inspection. Psalm 26 and verse 2. Examine me, O Lord. Prove me. Try my mind and my heart. Now look, we should want the inspection and the examination of God. We should desire it. Because look, none of us should ever desire that there be any fault in us that goes unchecked. Is that right? None of us want to be with any type of spot or blemish as we stand before God. But sometimes we can't see ourselves clearly. Is that right? Sometimes we, how would I say it? Sometimes we tend to ignore some of our own faults. Make excuse for those things. Well, yeah, but so-and-so does worse. You see, but God's not going to examine us against so-and-so. So the best way for us to be examined by God is to read God's Word, and then anytime we find ourselves in some type of error or deficiency, then we make that change. Now, it's not technically us making the change. It's God. It's allowing God to make the change in us. So we want to present ourselves before God. By the way, I looked this up. I just thought about this afternoon. In Romans chapter 6 and verse number 16. I want you to look at Romans 6 and verse 16. Do you not know that to whom you present yourselves, there's our word. That is the exact same word as is in Romans chapter 12. To whom that you present yourselves, slaves to obey, you are that one's slaves whom you obey, whether of sin leading to death or of obedience leading to righteousness. Why should I desire to present myself before God? Because the only other option is to present myself as an instrument of sin. And I don't want to do that. Because Paul says if I present myself as an instrument to sin, ultimately that leads to death. But when I present myself to be an instrument of God, that leads to life. So that same word is right there. And so the idea of presenting ourselves is also the idea of yielding. Is yielding. Who are we going to yield to? Are we going to yield to sin, or are we going to yield to God? Then third paragraph. Present yourselves a living sacrifice. A living sacrifice. Now look, this concept is found all throughout the New Testament. The idea of being a living sacrifice. For example, Jesus said, if any man will follow me or come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross daily, and follow me. And the cross is an instrument of death. It's not just an instrument of punishment, it's an instrument of death. It's like the electric chair. It's like the gallows. Nobody goes to the gallows, and walks away. Nobody goes to the electric chair and walks away. Nobody went to the cross and walked away. So when Jesus says that we deny ourselves and take up our cross, and yet we're still following Him, there is implied in that statement a death. And yet we're still alive, serving the Lord. Present your bodies as living sacrifices. Paul made an allusion to the same. I'm crucified. There's our death word again, our execution word. I'm crucified with Christ. Nevertheless, I what? Live. I live. Yet not I, but Christ lives in me. In the life I live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave Himself for me. So not only living, but living by faith in the Son of God. And then I thought about this passage in 1 Corinthians 15:31. Paul said, I die daily. I die daily. And I connect that verse directly to Luke 9:23 because of all the take up your cross and follow me statements that are found in the gospel accounts, Luke's is the only one that attaches the word daily to it. Take up his cross daily and follow me. And Paul says, I die daily. I cannot help but think Paul is got Luke 9:23 in his mind when he made that statement. All right, then present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. The word reasonable appears only twice in the New Testament, this particular word. And the other is in 1 Peter 2 and verse 2, and it's rendered word. So there's the word. It's not a discrepancy, but this word is not common, and its usage is a little bit, and I don't want to use the word inconsistent, but the usages are different. How's that? They're different. The word's used by Paul in one sense, and by Peter in a slightly different sense. But in this text, that which is rational and appeals to the mind is the primary emphasis. That's what I said. It's your reasonable. It's your reasonable. And by the way, some of your renderings, like New American Standard, I think the English Standard, are going to render this word as spiritual. Do you have spiritual there? Okay, if you have spiritual, I don't like spiritual either because spiritual seems to be kind of nebulous, right? What exists in the spirit realm or the realm of spirituality can sometimes be a little bit nebulous, whereas what Paul's really talking about is what is in our mind. What is in our mind. And so this is what appeals to our reason or our rationality. Now, the word service, which is your reasonable service. Now, again, I don't know, I haven't looked at the ASV of 1901. I suspect it probably says service. Almost all of the modern renderings of this word incorporate the word worship in them. The New International, which Cottrell's, the commentary that I spend most of my time in preparing this material, but also in the Truth for Today series, you'll find phrases such as, which is your spiritual service of worship. Your spiritual service of worship. And that's just not a very good rendering at all. It's not good at all. And I want to focus for a minute on this word service. Okay? And look, some of you either aren't old enough or haven't been Christians long enough, or have been insulated by where you live and have probably never heard what I'm fixing to talk about. Okay? And that is the idea that all of life is worship. Have you ever heard that? That all of your life is worship. And the reason that primarily has come up is because the NIV first came out in 1973. And it was really popular among a lot of people, especially, even in the Brotherhood. And it incorporates the word worship there at the end of the verse. It's your spiritual service of worship. Trying to see if there was another. Well, the other rendering is, the updated NIV is, this is your true and proper worship. Well, that's not any good either. All right? There is a difference between worship and service to God. And the Bible is clear on that. From the Old and the New Testament. Okay? If I were going to draw a parallel of sorts, I would say all squares are rectangles, but not all rectangles are squares. Right? Is that right, Catherine? All squares are rectangles, but not all rectangles are squares. All right? All worship is service to God. Whenever we worship, we are serving God. But not all service to God is worship. You see how one is a specific of the broader. A square is a specific rectangle. Worship is a specific type of service to God. All of life cannot be worship. All of life cannot be worship. But all of life should be spent in service to God. Okay, and the New Testament uses specific language to distinguish between service and worship. All right, look at the second paragraph from the bottom. Service rendered to God, or the carrying out of religious duties. All right, now if you ever, and I gave you the definition here. The word latruo is the word that is used 21 times in Numbers chapter 4 to describe the priestly service in and around the tabernacle. I mean, in one chapter, now the Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures. Okay? And the word that was used to describe the priestly service is the word latruo. For example, the priest who's hauling out the ashes of the burnt offerings is rendering service, but he's not rendering worship. Whoever's washing, for example, if there's a priest who's washing the utensils that are used in sacrifice, if he's washing the utensils, that is a service to God that he's rendering, but the washing of utensils is not worship to God. If we were to bring this over into the New Testament, the idea is, for example, I'll give you an example. This is a long time ago. Most of y'all weren't even here back in those days. But there used to be two signs on the highway right here. On the Adopt a Highway. Y'all remember the Adopt a Highway program, right? And there was a sign up here at about the 253 marker, and there was a sign down at about the bridge, the Adopt a Highway. And it said, this section of highway has been adopted by the Burleson Church of Christ. All right, now, every so often, this was one of Diane's big things. Every so often, Diane would tell us what day we're going to get together and get our orange vests, and our garbage bags, and come out and pick up garbage. Okay, there's a sense in which when we do that, we're serving God, in the sense that we're trying to do our best to represent the church by that particular activity. Or at other times, if we were going to, by the way, this will take you back to, some of you won't remember this, but we used to go to Maywood one day every year in the month of May. And we had a cabin that belonged to Burleson, and we had to go and wash all of the mattresses, get all the pollen and stuff off the mattresses, wash the beds down, sweep the walls, sweep the floors, rake the leaves, pick up the limbs and set a fire and get everything around our cabin ready for camp the first week of June. There's a sense in which what we were doing was serving God. But we were not worshiping God while we were raking leaves. You see? We can serve God without worshiping God. Worship requires a number of things. Number one, it requires intent and focus. In order to worship God, God has to be our singular focus. There has to be an intention to serve God. And then our worship is regulated by the Word of God. We must worship Him in spirit and in truth. Right? John 4:24. Jesus made the statement in Matthew chapter 4 verse 10. You shall worship the Lord your God, and Him only shall you serve. The word serve there is latruo. latreo. The word for worship there, which is, it's on your next page, is the word proskuneo. And the two words are not the same. And if you were to do a word search on the two words that come from latreo, if you were going to do like a Strong's number search, it'd be numbers 2999 and 3000. If you were going to look at those two words, you could type those up online and find every instance of those words. And in almost every case, it's clearly talking about serving God in our everyday lives. Not talking about the formal worship of God. And so when I first got into ministry back in 1991 is when I was first exposed to the idea of the false idea that all of life is worship. And everybody, without fail, who taught that error pointed to Romans 12 and verse 1 and the New International Version or the New American Standard Version to defend that idea. I remember reading, this would have been 1992 or 93, and I bet you if I went in my office and got in my filing cabinet, I could find it. There was an article by the editor of Christian Woman magazine, which was one of our publications. And I'm not going to name the lady that wrote it. I knew her husband reasonably well. They lived in Arizona when I lived out there. And she made the statement about she says, whether I'm worshiping God sitting on top of a mountain or ladling soup in a soup kitchen for the homeless. She goes, because all of life is worship. And guess what citation she gave? Romans 12:1. Romans 12:1. And so, most of you probably never even heard that idea before. And again, there's a lot of reasons for it. Mostly because in this area, and you should be thankful for this, that a lot of the foolishness that has run through the brotherhood never made it to this part of the world. Because of the soundness of the brethren, the soundness of the congregations. People didn't teach these types of things. Nobody ever stepped into the pulpit at Barn Creek or White House and said all of life is worship. And if they did, they only said it once. So a lot of the things that I had to deal with in Tennessee, Arizona, Missouri, you've never heard of. But this is still a problem. This mentality is still a problem, and a lot of it goes to the what I would just say a poor rendering of Romans chapter 1. Okay? Oh, I hadn't thought about that, but I guess I'd say that is right. You've heard it? Did y'all hear that? Scott was making the note that a lot of people use this same argument to defend instrumental music. That all of life is worship, and if you can listen to, for example, instrumental religious music in your vehicle going down the road, then that's no different than having it in the assembly. And so when you start with a false premise, there's a lot of bad directions that you can go in. I can remember going to there was a Christian Family Services meeting when I was in the St. Louis area, and they had a group kind of come in and sing kind of like a Christian chorus or something like that. And they came and they sang and whatnot. And it was like on a Friday or Saturday night. And I remember talking to some of the other youth ministers in the area, and we were talking about the matter of worship. And one guy that was a youth minister in there, he goes, I don't know what you believe. He said, but when I was sitting there listening to them sing, I was worshiping. And all I said was, not by the definition of the word you weren't. If you'll study what the word means, you'll realize that you were not worshiping while you were sitting there passively listening to someone sing religious songs. So, and that would have been in 91. Okay, in 1991, so 34 years ago. I was already knee deep in that type of attitude. And I gave some of the examples there at the bottom of the page. The soup kitchens, listening to choruses, and then I just noted that the updated NIV, which made a lot of improvements over the original, still, I think, made a mess of this one. Top of page 2, we'll deal with this definition and close this out for tonight. There is a different Greek word that speaks to the formal worship of God, namely proskuneo. It's the word that appears in John 4:24. It's the word we would commonly associate with the formal public worship of God. God is spirit, and those who worship Him must worship Him in spirit and in truth. The word worship there in both cases is the word proskuneo. And it means literally to kiss toward, to fall down, to prostrate one's self in the presence of God. And it's a very specific word. It's a very specific word. I've had this on my computer for, I can't tell you how long, 30 years at least. And it was, if all of life, and this is the article, it's called, If All of Life is Worship, Abraham didn't know it. Because he said, abide here and the lad and I will go yonder and worship. Obviously Abraham didn't think he was worshiping God as he traveled to the mountain, where, he and Isaac, would end up. Moses didn't know it. It says, take heed to yourselves that your hearts be not deceived, and you turn away and serve other gods and worship them. See the difference between serving and worshiping. Joshua didn't know it because he wrote Joshua 5:14, and it says, Joshua fell on his face to the earth and did worship. And did worship.
That's right there. We don't understand. He was flat on the ground.
Flat on the ground. I mean, that's literally what the word means to do. Now, the New Testament uses the term in that sense, like when people fell, like when Cornelius fell down at Peter's feet to worship him. He fell on the ground. And people fell on the ground at Jesus' feet. Okay, and so the word includes that, but it doesn't necessitate that. It doesn't necessitate that. But I had a whole list. I had a whole list of statements where the Bible talked about people doing one thing and then going to worship. And it wouldn't say that if all of life is worship. All right. Verse 2 next week, or 2 weeks.